A warm welcome to the United Nations Leaders Summit, to the PRIME panel, How do we enable business leaders to tackle global wicked problems? My name is Mette Morsing and I'm the Global Head of PRIME, Principles for Responsible Management Education, based at the UN Global Compact Office in New York. And I'm truly delighted here today to have with me 4 expert panelists to help us explore and provide ideas on this important matter and for engaging with the PRIME community and on education in higher institutions. It is an honor and a true privilege to moderate such an authoritative and experienced panel to help setting a global tone, and I hope also help setting a new global tone for how we best advance innovative and creative problem solution in business. Accordingly and importantly, how can management education contribute to generate the talent needed? We know from several analyses that there is a need for innovative solutions to address the global challenges related to climate change, increasing inequalities, and not least to recover in the midst and in the wake of a global pandemic. The big question to this panel is how we may significantly educate in novel ways our business leaders and students to employ those innovative perspectives, creative approaches, and not least system thinking that is so urgently needed. So my ambition here with this distinguished panel is that you will enable me and the audience, not least, to think a little bit out of the box by suggesting cutting-edge ideas and examples from experimental learning, pedagogies to challenge what I would call sort of mainstream leadership education in the classroom. And I can say that because I've been there myself, doing the mainstream leadership education for many years, and I can see how there is a strong need for a change. So it is my true pleasure. Just let me briefly introduce my panelists here, and then I will let the panelists have some introductory remarks before we will have a little exchange and some questions and responses. And then I will ask the panelists to conclude by a recommendation for what is the most important next step for management education to generate the leaders that the world needs. So it is my true pleasure to have with me here today on the panel Professor Dr. Chik-Yong Kang, President and Dean at the Asian Institute of Management in the Philippines. Warm welcome, Chik-Yong. I also have here with me Bruno Roche, Founder and Executive Director Economics of Mutuality, and also a former chief economist at the Mars Company. And Bruno, you are based in Switzerland. Warm welcome to you. And I have here with me also John, who is the CEO of the Lego Foundation based in Denmark. Welcome, John. And finally, I have here with me Professor Dr. Maurice Mtombeni, Interim Dean at the Gordon Institute of Business Science based in South Africa. Warm welcome also to you, Maurice. So I am pleased to sort of let the floor over to you, Chik-Yong Kang, for your sort of first reflections on what is needed for management education, and what are the skills needed, and how do we approach this? Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mette. I think I want to start by sort of defining how I see the subject of wicked problem. So whenever I think of a wicked problem, I think about the film Imitation Game. I don't know if some of our audience has seen this film. Their protagonist, Alan Turing, is faced with an impossible problem of finding codes behind the Enigma machine used by Nazis. I'm sure some of you probably is coming back to you. He interacts with many people, go back and forth, and what appears to be seemingly non-linear manner. But eventually he strikes a breakthrough. When I hear the phrase a wicked problem, that's what I often think about. In other words, to me, a wicked problem often stems from social, economic, cultural, organizational issues and concerns that are difficult to explain to begin with, and therefore sometimes feels inherently impossible to solve. Indeed, many of today's problems are increasingly complex and indeed wicked, but be it climate change, sustainability, pandemic, drug trafficking, homeless, social injustice, all these wicked problems are complex and ambiguous, but quite often also very much of a non-linear in terms of its occurrences and interactions with other problems, and with no simple, seemingly no simple solutions, or sometimes it appears there are no solutions at all. Professor Rob Bentudler at Rotterdam School of Management, who has extensively researched the UN SDGs, say, and I quote, "Wicked problems are systematic, complexly interrelated, and materialize at the interface between public, private, and profit, non-profit interests, and they are wicked by nature and design." So given the multidimensionality, complexity, ambiguity, and pervasiveness of wicked problems, but coming from business school community, I then ask, what are the leadership competencies required to solve these wicked problems? And can those competencies be taught? But unfortunately, the conventional models and frameworks, I think this one we are sure about, do not help solve the new world wicked problems, whether these leadership competencies that can be taught or not. I think that's very clear. And that is because these wicked problems are often characterized by novelty and disruption. In fact, I believe the high turnover of senior executives in and out of CEO roles is partially because of their inability to work at wicked problems. The late distinguished statesman and Secretary of State, George Shultz, famously said, there is a huge difference between problems you can solve and problems you can only work at. So to navigate and work at wicked problems, I believe there are some mutually reinforcing mindsets a leader should have. And this is not an exhaustive list by no means, but I think first leaders need to have a curiosity. I think, when we are young, we often ask why, and often annoy our parents quite great deal. But I think at some point, a lot of us adults, we stop asking this question, whys. I also believe leaders need to be willing to be imperfectionists, because oftentimes we need to tolerate ambiguity. We need to be willing to take action, even though we may not see a solution we have in hand is perfect. They also need to have a dragonfly view. In other words, they need to have 360 degrees of perception. And that is often without specific domain expertise, why some people can be very good at forecasting events because they can have a dragonfly view. Also, I think leaders need to pay attention to what actually happens in a time and place and restfully experiment with the different solutions rather than looking for a perfect solution. Also, they need to be willing to tap collective intelligence rather than thinking all solutions, all intelligent, smart people are within their own organization only. But I think maybe lastly, what I would like to say is they also need to recognize that the power of storytelling can often lead to action. And oftentimes, if we practice show and tell, it could lead to good outcomes. So for example, one of the tools that we could use in training future leaders is what we call systems thinking approach. In this approach, this is a paradigm where it will help us to look at interconnected nature of the issues. It's a very way of thinking characterized by holistic view of the world. It often focuses on the connectedness of the problems, and it can consider different kind of components, the divergent over convergent thinking. And also it allows us to shift to holistic approach that puts the problem on track to efficient tracking. So as I noted, wicked problems in problems pertain, among other factors, to societal complexities. And this also calls for what I call outside in, inside out approaches. It is also important, I firmly believe that today's leaders face challenges of Industry 4.0. So I think, looking at all the solutions, traditional ways of looking at tame problems are important, but indeed many of these challenges can be solved by combining technical skills as well as soft skills. I think that today's leaders should possess agility, flexibility, as well as emotional intelligence, and also should be tech savvy, and they should culturally intelligent as well. So I know that's a lot of different things, but I think that's what it requires to solve big problems.
Yes. Thank you very much. And you being the president of a university and of a school, you know yourself that this is a huge challenge. But thank you very much, Ji-Kyung, for pointing out the curiosity needed and also the interconnectedness, and that this is also a journey towards, perhaps never perfect, but a journey towards. So thank you very much for this. Bruno, over to you. I mean, you come from a completely, you could say, sort of different context, and you have a particular concept that I was curious to introduce, you know, in this conversation, the economics of mutualities. So welcome, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mette. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start with your actually quite unusual question. How do we enable business leaders to tackle global wicked problems? And as I was reflecting on these challenging questions, came to me a great quote from a thinker of antiquity who said, "For the love of money is a source of all kinds of evil." It's not the only one, but it is a source of all kinds of evil. And in a sense, we, over the last 50 years, the business has primarily been interested in maximizing profits for the benefit of one stakeholder only, which is primarily the shareholder. And actually, if you put it into the context, 50 years ago, financial capital was scarce, right? But natural resources, for instance, were perceived as overly abundant. And in economics, it's relatively simple. Economics is the management of scarcities. So 50 years ago, it made sense actually to focus on the creation of financial capital because we needed it. Today, financial capital is overly abundant. We have negative interest rates. Actually, I live in Switzerland and we are dealing with that. But other forms of scarcities exist now. And economics is all about addressing these new forms of scarcities. At the same time, over the last 50 years, business have become the number one driver actually of it's the most dominant economic power. 50 years ago, it was nation states. Today, it is the role of multinational corporations. So in a sense, you could argue that the role of business is essentially to invent a new economic model that will address this new form of scarcities. And actually, the concept of mutuality or reciprocity, if you like, and the concept of the economics of mutuality is to demonstrate that a model that is based on a reciprocal relationship and not on power relationship. And a model that is mobilizing different forms of capital, not only financial capital, but all the form of capital that the company needs to operate and prosper. Social capital, human capital, natural capital. So when you apply the discipline, the power of management to this kind of capital, the same level of intentionality that you apply to financial capital, you end up with a model which actually is superior in terms of value creation. But there is something else which is happening because to collect money, to manage financial capital, you need to get money from lenders, from shareholders. Okay, it's one form of capital. And you go to the bank and you go to the financial markets. But when you come to social, human, natural capital, you need to go to different kinds of banks. Okay, you need to go to society. You need to go to universities. You need to go to the land, to the planet. And therefore, there is a need actually to understand how these different capital can be mobilized. And therefore, that's why it's no longer a power relationship, but it's becoming a reciprocal relationship. So the whole demonstration of the economics of mutuality is that, yes, financial capitalism works, but it is suboptimal. And actually, there is a higher level of value creation of prosperity, which has to embrace a different form of capital, but also different form of stakeholders. And that the type of relationship you want to engage with different form of players is not through power, but it is through reciprocal, hence the word economics of mutuality. And it goes back actually to the source of all kinds of evil, right? If finance is supposed to be in service of the economy, and the economy is supposed to be in service of society. And unfortunately today, it's a bit the opposite. Actually, it is the society which is in service of the economy, and the economy is in service of finance, and finance is in service of itself. So essentially, one of the wicked problems that we face today is that the purpose of business should not be to maximize profit. The purpose of business should be to maximize or to create profitable and scalable solutions to the problems of people and planet, not profiting from creating problems. So in a sense, from a management education perspective, I think it all starts with education. If you want to achieve a systemic change, you need to start with education. Then you move to implementation, right, in the business context. Then you move to finance, because essentially investors have to realize actually that investing in responsible business pays off. And eventually you have an impact on regulation. But it all starts with education. And my dream and my vision is that in the future, management education and is not only addressing this concept of responsible business on the margin as an elective, but at something which is at the core of the nature of the corporation. The nature of the corporation is not financial. The nature of the corporation is to solve in a profitable and scalable way issues that you have in the ecosystem. So my dream is that as we're moving forward, the curriculum will shift and it will start with the purpose of business or the nature of corporation, and that eventually finance would become an elective and not the other way around.
Bruno, thank you so much for this wonderful vision. I like what I hear, and I think that this is a really daring, a cutting-edge vision for management education to turn around the dice, if you like, and to put an emphasis on society and being in the service of society. And the good news is, of course, that we can see that there is a lot of our students are actually asking for this. That's but thank you very much for these introductory remarks. I really appreciate it. John, over to you. Also from a slightly different angle, but in my mind at least, it all fits together into a wonderful jigsaw puzzle of how we can take this important agenda forward. So you, from CEO from the LEGO Foundation, please, John.
Great, thank you, Mette. Super inspiring comments so far from my fellow speakers, and I think we've already teed up that the autocratic image that I think is prevalent in society about leadership is really well aligned with the disproportionately cognitive focus of the existing business and management school education. And that sort of form of leadership is really good for quick linear decisions in well-established subject areas, but it's less good in the context of the wicked problems that Jin Keong has really well articulated. In Daniel Epstein's book entitled The Range, he's presented this idea that solving wicked problems really requires individuals with the ability to integrate diverse experiences and perspectives. But we live in a society where we have a lot of specialization, with experts given a particular status around decision making. And that prevails into leadership as well, which is to Bruno's point on this disproportionate focus on finance and that central tenet. I can say that as a former CFO. But what we need to do is come at these wicked problems from a multiplicity of angles, and leaders need that skill set to be able to be collaborative in the decision-making process. So that's why this holistic skill set, I think, is really important. However, as we've touched upon, business schools and the leadership programs are often really disproportionately focused on maximizing economic profits. So we need to challenge that established order if we're going to get to solutions of the SDGs through this leadership approach, because I believe there's a real skills gap that's being created due to this prevalence of cognitive thinking versus the holistic thinking. And that's where I believe we need to insert new methodologies and pedagogies into the equation. So in the LEGO Foundation, we've reviewed and conducted much research in learning as it pertains to children's development. And based on our research, we've really worked towards identifying what are those characteristics that are most effective for learning. And that's when we have children engaged in a joyful, a socially interactive, actively engaging, iterative way where the content's made meaningful in the context of the learner's experiences. Now, we have a theory that there's a parallel to that in the context of leadership development and training that is not singly about learning content and then repurposing it into the same environments or even different environments but with the same philosophy, but instead being able to be adaptive and really approaching problems from different ways, because that's the source of those wicked problem solutions. So we are really looking to draw upon that research that we've conducted and find ways in which we can translate that across into the learning realms of management and business schools to see whether or not we can create a more holistic approach to leadership development that will open up new vectors of solutions that are based on critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration and co-creation versus the disproportionate cognitive solutions of the past.
Thank you so much, John, for pointing out the need for the holistic skill set here in management education, in leadership education, and also based on, I think, very, very interesting, based on the robust research that has been done on another age group, you could say, in the LEGO Foundation, namely children, and how we could sort of learn from that into higher education, because it's not just the research, it's also very, very long-standing experiences that you have in the LEGO Foundation with actually educating children to have a more holistic skill set and to be more creative and imaginative in their life, you could say. Thank you so much, John. Now, Maurice, over to you. You are on a daily basis, the dean of a large school in South Africa, and you've been working with these ideas and these challenges for a number of years. So I'm curious to hear your reflections on how do we approach this. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mette, and thank you, everyone. At the risk of being a business school apologist, let me say that I have heard a lot of the criticism, particularly from our practitioner colleagues like John and Bruno, about how we in the business school community may need to be repurposed so that we are solving problems that matter. And I agree in part, but I thought perhaps I could share a case study, and that case study being our school, in terms of how we think of wicked problems. Firstly, our context is we live in a wicked context. If you live on the African continent, you are living in a wicked context. And Bruno talks about scarcity. There is abundance and scarcity in equal measure, but it's completely unequally distributed. So the scarcity is broadly distributed to the broadest population, and the abundance is only limitedly distributed to the few. And this causes an unsustainable situation for over 1 billion people in our continent. So business schools like us then operate in this wicked context and have to solve for this. And the way we think about it, I suppose, if you wish, we think about it, what does it mean for a student journey? And what does it mean for an academic journey? And what does it mean for a school journey? And from a student journey perspective, we think of students being academic students, as well as corporate students, what others might call executive education. And then we have a very specific sector, which we call the social education sector. And here we're dealing with working with NGOs, with social entrepreneurs, with what would, I think, typically be called either minorities in other communities or the marginalized communities. And we work very closely in ensuring that we contribute towards them acquiring skills, knowledge, networks, contacts to be empowered. So for us, then how we think about wicked problems, just like Jae Kyung said, which is this notion of these are trisectoral problems. These are problems that sit at the intersection of business, society, civil society, and government. I suppose you could add a fourth sector, which is the environment, right? So these are all these problems that sit at in this intersection and requires multiple perspectives and to solve them. And solving them is not an event, it's a process. And in acknowledging that it's a process, you need to have a very low need for certainty, because I think in most business courses, we're trying to say, are you certain of this? Are you certain of that? And in fact, when you're dealing with wicked problems, you actually can't be certain of anything whilst you're solving it. You can only be certain of it after you've solved it. So it's a bit like Steve Jobs says, you join the dots looking backward, not looking forward. So this low need for certainty is really important when we think about wicked problems. And then another, I suppose, meta skill that you require is this deep awareness. You need to have an ability to probe and sense. And here I'm borrowing from the Cynefin framework of saying you need to kind of constantly be probing, constantly be sensing, and you need to be very sensitive because even the smallest change in this system perspective that others have been speaking about could have a huge impact. Again, this notion of the butterfly effect. So essentially for us, we're saying we begin with a student before they're even a student. So we create structures where we provide some of our education for free beforehand, and we experiment with students, with communities. And then when they want accredited programs, then we bring them into our program. And John, when we think about business school, we think about immediately post-school all the way to a PhD program. So we have quite a broad range of what business school means in a South African context, which is possibly different to what it might mean in a European context. And when they are in our programs in the class, we actually embed sustainability, innovation, and systems thinking as a program-wide view. So for example, on our 2-year MBA program, in the first year, all our students have to do something called an applied business project, which is linked to at least 2, if not 3 SDG goals, right? And they have to go and find a wicked problem, which they then solve with business. And then whichever business and society or government entities that they've partnered with, we then contract with them who are involved in giving them a grade, a mark, which contributes to their grade. So in other words, we're not the only ones who are assessing their work. Their work is also being assessed by social, business, and government partners. And we put through over 300 students a year on a program like this. And it's extremely successful in terms of how it's shifting not just their awareness, but also their behavior. And the feedback we get from their employers, where they're employed, or the programs that they work with is this is a very transformative experience. Then once they've left us in terms of to maintain this lifelong learning, what we then do is we partner them with our centers, and we've got 3 centers: Thought Leadership Center, a Center for African Markets and Management, Center for Leadership and Dialogue, and the Center for Business Ethics. And here we do some really interesting stuff with our partners, particularly Harvard Business School, and the work that we're doing in the Center for Business Ethics. This really brings me now to the last 2 points in terms of the journey for faculty, that the kind of academics that you then need to support this, we're saying need to really embody 4 principles. One of them, Zhekiong spoke about, which is this notion of curiosity. We say, but beyond curiosity, you need to be current. And the currency here for us now, Bruno, I fully agree with you, is that the scarcity problem was about finance, whereas now the scarcity problem is about much broader issues other than finance. It's about natural resources, it's about our environment and so forth. And so be current and be on top of what is required when you're teaching. Be collegial, both within the school and outside of the school. So we drive international connections. And also we research in this space. So research things that build your credibility. So for example, one of my PhD students is researching, that I'm supervising, is researching the area of alternative and anti-consumption. And this guy works for a bank, and he's a very senior guy in a bank. and is learning about what are the anti-consumption mechanisms or the alternative consumption mechanisms we can embed in a banking system to ensure that we have sustainable banking as opposed to banking that is driving profit. And finally, at a school journey level, it's about partnerships, about really connecting both in the West and the East. And I've mentioned some of our partners, HBS on the West. On the East, we partnered with ZEBS. And I think we had a session with ZEBS in another time at Prime, as well as in our continent. We've partnered with CEBS Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah. And all of these partnerships bring diversity of ideas, diversity of experiences, which helps us to connect with the best thought in the world and to connect our students, both current and past, in this broader ecosystem of people that are really interested in solving problems that matter. And finally, for you, John, I thought you might want to know, Lego. Unfortunately, it's an elective. So one of our electives is built around Lego principles, and you find these MBA students actually playing Lego games, Monopoly and anti-Monopoly, to kind of find out different ways of being creative, of what is the consequence of being a monopolist and what is the consequence of being an anti-monopolist. So we pull all these games that are designed for children when you translate them into the world of adults, and it creates fun, and it actually opens up different channels of learning even in the adult space. So maybe you and I can connect after this session and we can share some of our experiences in this regard. Over to you, Mette.
Thank you so much, Morris. And thank you actually, Morris, for taking the whole sort of, when I'm looking at, and listening to the conversations here, for taking it, the whole tour around and getting back to the curiosity of Chee-Kyung and the collegiality of Bruno and the holistic skill set of John. And the hands-on, minds-on that you talk about, when you talk about in your MBA classes about actually playing with Lego bricks and having fun in a playful way, whilst, of course, the ambition is for these students to learn. So thank you so much for this. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to my panel, and I now understand even more why I invited the four of you to be part of this wonderful discussion. I really appreciate it. My absolutely only concern is that time is flying, and it's just flying too fast. And so I'd like to invite you for a final little round here before we unfortunately have to close up, because we need to keep the time schedule here. But I would really like, and I would like Chee-Kyung to invite you just for brief reflection on, so if those creative skills, those holistic skill sets, the collegiality, the curiosity that you mentioned yourself, and perhaps even, the physical, the social, emotional skills that are needed, what do we do on the ground in the school, in higher education? Brief comment on this. What's the next important step to do something on this?
Right. I think this is $1 million question. So, one of my pet peeves for many, many years used to be, when you're in a PhD program, you learn all about how to do research and publish, but nobody teaches how to teach, right? And these days, I often talk about not only we have to teach and be a brilliant teacher on top of being a brilliant researcher, so we now have to be a Zoom teacher, how to be teaching on a digital platform, and nobody ever taught to be an actress or actor, right? But I think this issue of sustainability is one of those my pet peeves. As a business educator, and I ask, how can business school help tackle this wicked problem? Or more specifically, how can business schools invest in SDG leadership competencies? How can business educational curriculum, pedagogical approaches can actually do something about this? This is wicked problem that is really critical and imminent. It's not something that we have to think about sometime in the future. It's right here with us. I think what we need is re-engineering that starts with the wicked problem, rather than plugging that in. One of our panelists mentioned it's not just an elective problem that you can tackle in an isolation. I think much of the problem solving in MBA curriculum, for example, with some exceptions, and not about solving wicked problems, but it is about solving tame problems, if I may call that, where there is mostly linearity, mostly predictability. I'm not saying that those problem-solving skills that tackle the legacy business issues are not important. But I think the business school leadership, our professors, our researchers, we all need to think about how we play our role in the scheme of things. So I can think about three broad ideas. For one, I think we need to adapt some of our business school curriculum to address these wicked problems at a fundamental levels. Again, it's not an isolated problem that can be taught in 1 or 2 courses. We also need to produce, align more cases, problem-solving tests and projects that will allow our students to tackle wicked problems. Most importantly, I think we need to expose our students to these wicked problems from the young age, and then they need to be part of the problem solving. So what Mars have been doing, I often talk about when I talk about this Go-To initiative at Oxford. They work very closely with the industries in solving real world wicked problems oftentimes. And I think those are the kind of environment that we need to create to expose and change our students.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Taekyung. Thank you very much for this. And I really also appreciate, your comment about educators not being educated to educate, but to research. And it's a fundamental issue. Thank you very much for pointing that out as well. And over to you, Bruno, about, again, what is your recommendation to us as, leadership educators, if economics of mutuality should sort of be unfolded into a large-scale practice? I know it's you are working already with universities and schools on this principle, but what do we need to do next to actually turn a bit around the way we teach education, where we usually put the corporation at the center of the stakeholder model and not society at the center? So how do we do this?
Right. I think in a sense, if we want to achieve the level of systemic change we want to reach, we need in a sense to consider and to think about education, but not in isolation of other disciplines. And I know actually in the academic world, and actually I'm coming from an academic myself, so I ended up in business, but my education was also at PhD level, so I know a little bit how it works. And I think there is silo thinking in academia, but I think it goes beyond silo thinking. It's actually about embracing issues like, of course, education is an important one, different function, different discipline in management, but also there is an element of real practical implementation in business and in education and in investment, but also more and more the role of government and the role of regulation is critically important. So in a sense, as in my initial remark, I said something that 50 years ago, nation states were much bigger in terms of size and influence than business. Nowadays, it's just the opposite. I mean, many multinational corporations have more power and influence than many nation states, and yet they are ill-equipped to handle the complexity that their size and influence confer on them. So in a sense, business today are no longer economic players, they are also political players. They play a role in society. So in a sense, blending also with responsibility, you also have the element of course, of political science and governance. So I think in a sense, you should not really think about management education in isolation of the practical aspect, of course, in business and investment, but also the very practical aspect of the impact we have on regulation and the impact that regulation will have on business. So I'd like to finish on maybe on one note is that, I love this quote to say that my people perish because of lack of knowledge. So people perish because of lack of knowledge. And knowledge actually is coming from asking questions. I mean, never stop asking questions. And if there is one thing actually I like to leave as on a high level thinking is that business education actually is not about applying processes and tools and principles. It's about thinking, it's about asking, it's about having a critical mind. It's about actually understanding that the world is changing, and not only changing, but it's changing fast. So in a sense, the recipe of the past are no longer a good fit for the problem of today and even less of the problem of the future. So when you have new wine, you have to invent new wine skins. And that actually is a role, in my view, of management education, is to provide the new wine skin for the new wine that's coming.
Bruno, thank you very much for these words, and also for pointing out the importance of learning, teaching students to ask questions, and having a trust in the student agency that they're actually able to do so. Yeah, thank you very much for these final remarks from you, Bruno. Now, John, over to you. What is your recommendation for a final remark, your recommendation to higher education to sort of actually address and approach those holistic mindsets? Again, acknowledging that faculty is not trained to do so. Over to you, John.
Yeah, and I'll try and keep brief in the interest of time. I would, adding on to what my fellow panelists have said, I think we need to really examine what is the primary purpose of or approach to recognition of the existing faculty. Because if we continue to drive recognition through publication, and their work in the development side is almost a sideshow. I know I don't want to insult anybody, but just in the context of the structure, then I think we run the risk that we're not forcing the creativity and the stimulation in different pedagogical approaches that Maurice was outlining, which I think is fantastic and provides that public-private interaction that really grows the leaders that we need for tomorrow, that have the alternative thinking that Bruno was indicating. So I would encourage the business schools to really rethink how is it that they are recognizing and acknowledging those teachers and professors within their structures that are pushing the boundaries when it comes to not only teaching, but also facilitation and coaching and development of the leaders of tomorrow to have impact, and start putting measurement in place in order to monitor that.
Thank you so much, John, for pointing out one of the crucial points in the business school and higher education, and that is, of course, the tenure track, the promotion system. Because as it is right now, the promotion system primarily sort of addresses research criteria and much less so education. I think that's fair to say on an average global level. So how do we change that? How do we make education as important as research? Thank you so much, John. Maurice, over to you for a final comment here on, what is your recommendation from the Dean perspective on what's the next important step we can do locally, but also maybe to scale globally, these ideas that we have touched upon here in this panel.
Thank you. Well, the first thing is to make sure my boss is listening, and if he isn't listening, for him to get this a version of this talk so that he can understand what global leaders are thinking about how we need to tackle these wicked problems. But very briefly, I think we should all start sharing what works and what we've seen work in other places in terms of redesigning our programs towards this purpose. As I said earlier, we embed SDGs in the first year broadly. Then on our MBA program, specifically in the second year, we then have the golden thread of responsible leadership. And so really what I think is important is really getting people to recognize that an exclusive society is not a sustainable society, but an inclusive society is really essential. And that's what we should be driving business school to focus on having this inclusive and including mindset. And because we see with the COVID-19 vaccines, for example, that if only the few, the wealthy, the exclusive keep them, the world is not healthy. But if we are able to find a way of distributing and sharing the essential resources, like the vaccine, like management and business education, embedded in sustainable logics, we are able to solve wicked problems. Thank you, Mette.
Maurice, thank you so much for this concluding note. I do hope that your boss was listening to the conversation here, and that many other bosses are listening to this wonderful conversation here on how do we enable business leaders to tackle global wicked problems. I am super happy to have been moderating this wonderful panel and this very exciting discussion, and the insights that you bring to the discussion on curiosity, on collegiality, on asking questions, on holistic skill sets, on business, civil society engaging together, and maybe think about how we can have finance the elective in higher education, and what ways and what that will imply for how we sort of design our business schools and our universities to create the leaders that the world need. Thank you so much, Chik-Young, Bruno, John, Morris. It has been a true pleasure to moderate this panel, and I hope we can continue the conversation in some other fora very soon future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.